The Wild West, a dangerous frontier where cowboys, gunslingers, and outlaws eke out a hard living. With little to lose, pioneers, adventurers, and people looking for a better life take their chances in the hard wilderness. The Wild West is a setting steeped in adventure and appeals to something deep in our collective minds. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a classic western town, the setting of the gunfights, bar brawls, and horse chases that make the West so much fun, so you can create some adventures of your own. The Wild West and cowboy movies are something that have fascinated moviegoers since the very start of cinema. And while many of the genre's greatest scenes take place on speeding trains or game trails, for my money, the most iconic location in the Wild West is the main street of a frontier town, where hot tempers and whiskey tumble out of saloons into the streets. Flanked by buildings, it's the quintessential location for a showdown. To make a western town, we need to understand a little bit about the architecture of the frontier. Frontier towns were often built quickly, springing up overnight as the railway was constructed or if gold was found nearby. But to project an image of stability and success, builders often used what's called a false front, a decorative facade designed to make the building look larger and grander than it really was, and to hide the hasty construction behind, which was oftentimes even temporary. So in the spirit of that Wild West technique, I'm going to show you the most efficient way to get your western town looking prosperous. First things first, let's start with the facade. The most common material for construction in the Old West was wood, and many buildings had wooden siding, thin wooden planks that overlapped each other. To create this look, let's start with some thin cardboard. I like to use cereal boxes. If you plan ahead, you can save empty ones before discarding them, or in a pinch you can just evict the bag of cereal inside. After opening the box, I square off the sides, making a nice thin sheet. I cut the sheet into 1 centimeter strips, then measure ½ centimeter guidelines on a piece of foam core board. Glue the strips down in overlapping layers, giving myself a pre-made sheet of construction material that looks like the wooden siding on a building. Now without a doubt, the most time-consuming part of making a miniature building from scratch is the windows and the doors. If you can find a way to save time on these, you can build many buildings in the time it would take you to build just one. Now in the past, I've used matchsticks to make window frames or bits of Lego windows or other toys, but today I'm going to use the 3D printers supplied by the sponsor of this video, AnkerMake. They sent me this AnkerMake M5C to try out, and after unboxing it, it went together quickly and easily with just a few screws. Everything is controlled through the AnkerMake app, and it's connected to Wi-Fi, which means you don't have to trek back and forth with memory cards or USB sticks. You just find some files you like, open the AnkerMake slicer, click slice, and send the file directly to the printer. For small detailed pieces like these windows and doors, I use the built-in precision mode, which as you might have guessed gives a more precise and detailed print. Now while my windows were printing, I made several sheets of this siding wood. With a pencil, I measure and plot out where I want the windows and doors to go, then with a sharp knife I cut through the layers of cardboard and foam core and make the openings I need. This method is great because I don't have to manually plank around the windows and doors after cutting, and I save tons of time using these pre-made planking sheets. When my doors and windows are printed, I simply insert them into the apertures, and I already nearly have a presentable facade. Another iconic feature of a Wild West town is balconies, and a main street definitely won't look right without a few of those. So I start by making a wood frame with some 3/16 inch basswood, which is like balsa wood but a bit more durable. I then block in the remaining walls of the building with foam core, making sure that the side and back walls are lower than the front facade. I measure a base for the whole piece with some 1/2 inch insulation foam. For other buildings I just used foam core board for this, but this will be a spacious raised porch, nicely shadowed by the balcony overhead. For the roof I use a piece of medium chipboard, a thick card product. I'm going for a flat roof here for a few reasons. Many houses in the Wild West had a sloped or gabled roof, but I'm going to be using my Wild West town to play a miniature game that my friend developed called Dead by Lead, and we'll talk more about that later. The bottom line though is that a nice flat roof will be easier to put minis on. I want guys to be able to aim over these facades and take part in the shootouts happening in the town below. In a climate with a lot of rain, a flat roof wouldn't fly, but I'm going for a dry, dusty frontier town, maybe somewhere in the American Southwest. With little precipitation, you can get away with a flat roof. I add a bit of chipboard trim to cap off the facade with a decorative border. Now here's how we can make a bunch of these simple facades look like a varied and interesting town. Simply by varying the facades. I make a few different shapes, some stepped, some rounded, with little gables, etc., just to add some variety. Now in the Old West, horses were the main source of transportation, which means that the streets weren't always very clean, so it was common to have a raised wooden sidewalk in front of the buildings. To make this, I'm simply going to add a bunch of planks from coffee stir sticks to the front of my buildings. If you have a light touch, you can just sort of massage them into place, like this. Beautiful. The balcony is made in a similar way. Just add a few cross planks and then plank it the same way. So here is another place where the 3D printer is extremely handy. Making a balustrade of railings would be damn near impossible to craft by hand. You could maybe make one out of toothpicks or something, but it would take hours. But with the trusty AnkerMake M5C that I've been sent, I can print up a bunch of balustrade rails in like 40 minutes while I work on other things. This hybrid method is the reason I'm able to build a whole little town in such a short period of time, and I have to say, it's quite gratifying. Now, if you are, for example, somebody who doesn't like crafting or doesn't have much time for crafting, you could always print the entire buildings as well. Now, there's some pretty good files out there. This one is from Hartolia Miniatures, and I thought I'd make a nice augmentation to my scratch-built buildings. The file originally came at HO scale, which is pretty small, so I scaled it up 150%. Once it's printed with a little bit of super glue, I can add another building to my main street in no time at all. Now the centerpiece of my street is going to be the big saloon. This is another shape that seems to have been really common in the Old West, at least in movies. A 2-story saloon on a corner with a wraparound balcony. Now using the same methods as before, it's pretty simple to make one pretty quickly. This time for the balcony I ended up gluing the planks down to some chipboard pieces first, which made it much easier to support and trim some of the unusual angled planks where the wraparound balcony edges meet. Again, some 3D printed balustrades, add a ton of detail really quickly. As someone who loves the hobby of scratch building, I love being able to find ways to leverage the technology while still having the creation be my own. And of course I had to add some iconic saloon style doors as well. All in all, I was able to make 9 Wild Westy buildings in just a few days, which is really pretty good. I took them to the garage and sprayed them all with a Rust-Oleum brown spray paint, which includes a heavy duty primer. Now while this dries, I'm going to make a nice desert mat to place everything on. This is a pretty simple process that I've covered on this channel before, but if you're new here, it goes like this. The game I'll be playing, Dead by Lead, needs a 3 foot by 3 foot area to play on, so I start with a larger sheet that I'll cut down later. Now it was a windy day, so I weighted it down with a couple big rocks from the garden. I mix up some sand with acrylic latex caulking, grout, acrylic paint, and a bit of rubbing alcohol into the mixture. I then spread this onto my mat, scraping it thin to get a smooth and even surface. The color of the mat ended up being a little bit more orange than I would have liked, so I tried sprinkling some dry grout onto it to lighten the color up, but I wasn't really able to control it. The wind really took it and... I'm sorry, dude. Anyways, what I was able to get on the mat didn't look very good, so I tried to blend it in and it just ended up chunking up the texture. But luckily, I discovered that if you apply some rubbing alcohol and then use a gloved hand, you can smooth out the surface to a nice smooth finish. This worked really well, and I soon had a nice even smooth surface which I left to dry. With my buildings primed a nice light brown, I started painting the facades. I wanted to add some color without overdoing it with brightness. I did a nice mix of bold and faded colors. The good people at the Army Painters sent me their new Fanatic paints to try out, and they have some great hues with strong coverage that make this part nice and easy. I originally painted my saloon this nice green hue, but I later changed my mind and decided to go for a more old-fashioned dark brown look. Before doing that though, I took advantage of my airbrush to paint the balustrades and windows. I once had a summer job painting a house full of radiator covers made from hundreds of slats by hand, and the trauma has never worn off, so it was immensely gratifying to get a nice whitewash on these bits with a few blasts of the airbrush. With the windows and rails painted, I come back in with a nice deep brown, cutting carefully around the windows. The saloon sign was another 3D printed bit, so I carefully painted in the negative areas of that before coming in with a lighter shade of brown to dry brush all that lovely siding. This really picks out the detail, making these simple buildings look a lot less like a children's toy and a lot more like the real locations they're meant to represent. With a tan color, I begin dry brushing all the facades. Now this is going to give things a nice weathered, dusty look that will enhance the realism and ground these buildings in reality, while also picking out some more details. I added an extra dusty scrubbing around the lowest bits of the building to tie them in with the dusty street. In addition to the buildings, I printed out some barrels and little fences to help fill out the table and make it feel like a real city. These fences could have easily been made by hand from stir sticks, but barrels are another detail that really helps to have printed. Instead of printing each fence on their own little base, I like to glue a barrel or two to each one. This provides the stability to have them stand on their own, while making the whole thing blend easily with any part of the table. I also took some time to paint up a bunch of cowboys and gunslingers. I used mostly speed paints for this. These allow me to get some bold colors and contrast on the minis really quickly. I'm going to be playing Dead by Lead on this table, so I'm going to need enough characters to make 2 gangs to have a showdown. The Dead by Lead rules have a really cool system for developing characters that affects how they play in the game. I specifically like how you can give your characters flaws that makes them cheaper but simultaneously gives them some drawbacks in the game. It's a great way to balance out the game while still adding a ton of flavor and uniqueness. If you want to get the Dead by Lead rules, I'll put a link in the description box below. I also find that the character comes out as I paint these little guys. I gave this guy, for example, red hair and green jacket, and he reminded me of the flag of Ireland, so he became Irish Bob, the leader of the Gritty Gulch gang. I also really like this guy. He's one of the official Dead by Lead minis. The way he's posed storming out of the saloon ready to brawl, I think he's perfect. Okay, time for my favorite part of the whole process, making a bunch of signs that will make these buildings really come to life. I started by downloading a bunch of free Western fonts, then in Photoshop started mocking up some imaginary businesses. I enjoyed looking at each of my little buildings and deciding which ones would be best for each business. Looking at the reference photos, a lot of the signs had more text on them than just what the business was, usually extra detail about the wares that they had or whatever, so I took that into account. I printed these signs off on paper, then glued them to some chipboard with a bit of Mod Podge. An extra layer of Mod Podge on top will protect the paper and allow me to paint over them without warping anything. For this hotel, for example, I painted in some colors onto the sign, since I don't have a color printer. I think it ended up looking pretty good. This restaurant sign I turned yellow with just a bit of thin yellow paint. With all the signs prepared, I attach them to their respective buildings, then give them a bit of weathering to tie them in with the rest of the structure. For the saloon, I added these 3 extra signs: poker, whiskey, and faro. If you don't know what faro is, it's some weird old-timey cowboy card game. I love adding little details like this. Speaking of details, as a final touch, I wanted to make a wanted poster to put up around the town. In my futuristic Necromunda city, I have posters looking for Big Rich Piana, who's one of the leaders of my Necromunda gangs, so I figured I'd mirror that here. It's such a small detail, but it ends up as kind of a fun Easter egg. I applied those in a few places, and boom, my city's pretty well done. So here it is, guys, the main street of Bloodstone, our very own western town. I can't wait to have some shootouts and adventures on this board. Huge thank you to the sponsor of this video, AnkerMake, and to all my Patreon patrons. If you enjoyed this content, please consider supporting me on there. I hope you guys liked this video, and we'll see you next time on Eric's Hobby Workshop.